A little boy ran into the vampire palace crying, "Help my mom!" The vampire king froze. "Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The night the boy arrived, the gates of the vampire palace had not opened for almost 100 years. The palace stood on a black mountain above the forest like a crown carved from shadow. Its stone towers pierced the storm clouds, and cold wind howled through the iron gates that guarded the entrance. For centuries, humans had whispered stories about this place. They said monsters ruled here. They said no human who entered the palace ever walked out again. Inside the grand hall, the court of vampires was gathered beneath chandeliers made of dark crystal. Hundreds of candles burned with pale blue flames, casting long trembling shadows across the marble floor. At the end of the hall stood the throne of King Alaric Nightfall, the ruler of the ancient vampire clans. His presence filled the chamber like winter frost creeping across a frozen lake. 600 years of power and silence rested in the stillness of his gaze. The nobles of the court spoke in low, careful voices, discussing ancient laws and distant wars. None of them expected the sound that suddenly echoed through the palace gates. Footsteps, small, desperate footsteps running across stone. The massive doors burst open with a violent crash. Guards spun toward the entrance, their silver armor flashing in the candlelight, claws half-drawn, fangs bared. And then they saw him, a human child. The boy looked no older than 7 years. His dark hair clung to his forehead, soaked by the rain. Outside, his small jacket was torn and mud covered his shoes. He stumbled across the polished floor, breathing hard like someone who had run for miles. Without stopping, the guards moved instantly. One stepped forward, raising a blade forged from silver. "Stop!" the child, a voice hissed. "Humans are forbidden inside these walls." But the boy did not stop. He kept running straight down the long hall toward the throne. Tears streaked down his face, and his chest rose and fell with every desperate breath. "Please," he cried, "please help my mom." The sound of his voice carried through the hall, and for a moment the entire court froze. Vampires who had hunted kings and conquered cities stared at the tiny figure racing across their sacred floor. Guards reached for him, ready to drag him away, but before anyone could touch the boy, King Alaric raised one pale hand. The hall fell silent. The command did not need words. The child collapsed at the base of the throne steps. His small hands gripped the cold stone as he struggled to breathe. His whole body trembled from exhaustion and fear. King Alaric slowly stood from his throne. His dark coat fell around him like the wings of a shadow. His crimson eyes studied the boy with a calm that made the air itself feel colder around them. The nobles whispered in outrage, "A human in the palace, kill him before he brings hunters." Silence. Alaric's voice was quiet, but the force behind it crushed every other sound in the hall. He stepped down from the throne, each movement measured and slow. When he reached the boy, he crouched until their eyes were level. The boy looked up with wide, terrified eyes and spoke again through shaking breaths, "Please help my mom." They took her. The words echoed across the silent chamber, and then the boy said a name. The moment that name left his lips, something impossible happened. The immortal vampire king did not move. He did not speak. He simply froze. King Alaric Nightfall did not move. The hall remained frozen in silence as the boy knelt on the cold stone steps of the throne. His small hands trembled against the dark marble, and rainwater dripped from his torn jacket, forming tiny pools beneath him. The vampire court watched with growing unease, because no one in this palace had ever seen their king react this way before. The name the boy had spoken still hung in the air like a ghost. "Clara Whitmore." For several long moments the ancient king said nothing. His crimson eyes narrowed slightly, as if he were staring through time itself. Then slowly, he stood to his full height again. The movement alone was enough to make every noble in the chamber fall silent. Commander Vex, the captain of the palace guard, stepped forward. "Carefully, my king, the human child should be removed before he contaminates the hall." Alaric lifted one hand again. The commander stopped at once. "Leave him," Alaric said quietly. His voice carried through the chamber with calm authority that no vampire would ever dare challenge. The boy looked up with wide, frightened eyes. His breathing was still uneven from exhaustion, but there was stubborn determination in his expression. "What is your name, child?" the king asked. "Ethan," the boy whispered. "Ethan Whitmore." At the sound of that last name, several older vampires exchanged uneasy glances. They had served the king for centuries, and they recognized the faint shift in his expression. The smallest shadow of memory passed across the face of the immortal ruler. Ethan continued speaking between shaky breaths. My mom told me to come here if something bad ever happened, she said. The vampire king owed her a favor. The court erupted with whispers. A human claiming a debt from the king was unheard of. Alaric raised his hand again, and silence returned instantly. Tell me what happened to your mother, the king said. Ethan wiped his wet face with the sleeve of his jacket, trying to steady his voice. We live in Hollow Creek, he said. It is a small town near the Northern Highway. My mom works at the diner on Main Street. She works there almost every day because it is just the two of us. His voice softened for a moment. She says the tips are better during the night shift. The king watched him carefully, but his expression remained unreadable. Continue. Ethan nodded slowly. 2 nights ago some men came to the diner. They were not normal customers. They were wearing dark coats, and they kept asking questions about my mom. The boy swallowed hard, remembering the moment I was waiting for her after her shift. When they grabbed her outside in the parking lot, they pushed her into a truck. I tried to stop them, but they shoved me away. His small fists tightened as he spoke. She told me to run, she said. If I could not save her, I had to come here. She said the king would remember her. The ancient court listened with cold curiosity, but none of them showed sympathy. Humans were fragile creatures in their eyes, yet Alaric did not interrupt. The king had seen thousands of human lives begin and end across the centuries, but something about this story held his attention like a distant echo of a forgotten promise. Ethan looked up again, desperation filling his voice. Please help her. They said they were taking her somewhere far away. I ran all night and all day to find this place. I did not know if the palace was real, but my mom said it was. She said the vampire king saved her once. A long time ago, she said. You would understand. The hall grew very quiet again. The storm outside howled against the ancient walls, but inside the chamber, every vampire waited for their king's response. Alaric slowly turned his gaze toward the massive windows of the palace. As lightning flashed across the mountains for the first time in many decades, a memory stirred deep within the mind of the ancient ruler. It was a memory of snow falling in silence, a narrow forest road, a young human woman standing between a wounded vampire and a group of hunters. Her voice had been steady, even though she was terrified. Run, she had whispered to the stranger. She did not even know. I will distract them. That woman had disappeared into the darkness before Alaric could repay the debt. Now the king's eyes returned to the trembling child on the throne steps. Clara Whitmore, he said softly. The name felt heavy on his tongue, like a forgotten oath. King Alaric. Nightfall remained silent for a long moment after speaking the name Clara Whitmore. The storm outside continued to rage across the mountain, but inside the great hall the air felt colder than the winter wind. Ethan still knelt at the base of the throne steps, his small shoulders shaking with exhaustion, yet he forced himself to remain upright, because the fate of his mother depended on the answer of the ancient king. Around them, the vampire nobles watched with narrow, suspicious eyes. Humans rarely entered the palace, and when they did, they never spoke to the king, as if they expected mercy. But Ethan had not come seeking mercy. He had come seeking a promise. Alaric slowly turned away from the boy and walked back toward the center of the chamber. His footsteps echoed across the marble floor. Each step measured, calm and heavy with authority. The court parted for him without a word, because every vampire in the room understood the power of the ruler they served. King Alaric Nightfall had ruled the vampire clans for more than 600 years. Long before the first American colonies were built, he had already commanded armies that crossed continents and brought rival vampire houses under a single crown. Many humans believed vampires were chaotic monsters hiding in darkness, but the truth was far more frightening. The vampire world was ruled by laws older than most human nations, and those laws were written in blood and silence. Alaric stopped before the throne again and rested one pale hand on the carved stone armrest. His crimson eyes slowly swept across the gathered nobles. As king, he carried a burden that few humans could imagine. Every decision he made affected thousands of vampires scattered across hidden cities, mountain fortresses, and underground sanctuaries. For centuries he had enforced the most important rule of their existence: the vampire clans must never involve themselves in human affairs, human conflicts, human wars, human suffering. These were matters for mortals alone. The law protected the secrecy of vampire society and prevented endless war between the two worlds. Any vampire who violated this rule faced punishment, even if they belonged to the highest noble families. Because of that law, King Alaric had ignored countless human tragedies across the centuries. He had watched kingdoms fall and cities burn without raising a single hand to interfere. It was not cruelty, it was survival. If vampires revealed their full power to humanity, the fragile balance between the two species would collapse, and the world would drown in blood. The nobles of the court trusted their king, because he had never broken that law, not once in 600 years. Commander Vex stepped forward again, carefully studying the king's expression. My lord, the situation is simple. The child claims a human woman named Clara Whitmore is in danger, but human problems are not the concern of the vampire throne. His voice remained respectful, yet firm. The law exists to protect our kind. If we intervene, we expose ourselves to hunters and inquisitors. Many of the nobles nodded in agreement. Ethan looked up at the towering figure of the vampire king, fear creeping back into his voice. My mom said you were not like the others. She said you keep your promises. The words echoed softly through the hall. Alaric did not immediately respond. His gaze lowered slowly until it met the frightened eyes of the child, and for a brief moment the ancient ruler seemed far older than 600 years. Memory was a strange burden for an immortal being. Humans forgot pain with time, but vampires remembered everything. Every promise, every betrayal, every life that had crossed their path could return without warning, like a shadow rising from the past. And now that shadow had a name, Clara Whitmore. The king straightened his posture again, and the quiet authority returned to his voice. The law remains unchanged, he said. Humans and vampires must remain separate. That has always been the rule, and it will continue to be the rule. The court relaxed slightly, believing the matter had been settled. Yet Alaric continued speaking, and his next words carried a weight that none of them expected. However, he said slowly, there are rare moments when a king must remember that laws were created by those with power, and those who create laws also carry the burden of honoring debts older than the law itself. The hall fell silent once more, because every vampire in the chamber understood the meaning behind those words. Somewhere in the distant past, the ancient king had made a promise to a human woman, and now her son had arrived at the palace gates to collect that debt. The great hall of the vampire palace remained silent after the king's words settled over the court like falling snow. Ethan Whitmore still knelt on the cold stone steps of the throne, his small hands gripping the edge of the marble, as if he feared the ground itself might vanish beneath him. The ancient nobles watched with cold curiosity, but none of them spoke, because everyone in the chamber understood that something unusual had begun. Commander Vex stood near the base of the throne, his silver armor reflecting the pale blue candlelight. My king, he said carefully, if the child speaks truth, we should gather information before deciding anything further. Human kidnappers rarely act alone. King Alaric did not immediately respond. His crimson eyes rested on the trembling boy. Ethan was trying to remain brave, but exhaustion was finally catching up to him. His shoulders sagged, and his breathing slowed into uneven bursts. Alaric stepped forward again, lowering himself slightly, so the boy could hear him clearly. Tell me everything that happened before your mother was taken. Ethan nodded weakly and tried to gather his thoughts. The rain-soaked memories were still fresh in his mind. It was late evening. He began. The diner was almost empty, because it was the middle of the week. My mom was cleaning the last table when those men came inside. They were not regular customers. They did not order food. They just sat there watching her like they already knew who she was. The court listened carefully as the boy spoke. Even the oldest vampires leaned forward slightly, because the tension in the king's presence had changed. Ethan continued. They kept asking strange questions. They asked how long we had lived in Hollow Creek. They asked if my mom ever traveled to the mountains near the old forest, and they asked if she remembered something that happened many years ago. The boy's voice trembled, but he forced himself to continue. My mom told them to leave. She said they had the wrong person, but when we walked outside after closing, they were waiting in the parking lot. There were more of them this time. They grabbed her before she could reach the car. Ethan lowered his head, his voice barely above a whisper. I tried to stop them. I threw rocks at their truck, but they just pushed me down. One of them said the words were clear enough to remember, tell the vampire king his debt has come due. The hall grew colder after those words. Several vampires exchanged uneasy glances. Debt was a dangerous word in their world, because ancient promises carried real power. Ethan wiped his face with the sleeve of his jacket and continued speaking. My mom looked right at me when they pulled her into the truck. She said, Ethan, listen carefully. If anything happens to me, you must run to the mountain palace, find the vampire king. Tell him Clara Whitmore never forgot the night in the snow. The Boy looked up again, desperation filling his voice. I did exactly what she said. I ran all the way through the forest. I followed the old highway until I saw the mountain. Then I climbed until I found the gates of this palace. I did not know if I would make it, but she said the king would remember. For a long moment no one spoke. The storm outside thundered across the cliffs, but inside the chamber every vampire watched their ruler, King Alaric. Nightfall slowly straightened his posture and turned toward the massive windows at the far end of the hall. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the dark mountains where the ancient forest still stood untouched by human cities. Somewhere in that wilderness, many years ago, a frightened human woman had stood between him and death. She had not known his name. She had not known what he truly was, yet she had chosen to protect him anyway. Now the king finally spoke, his voice low and steady. Clara Whitmore saved my life once, and now someone has taken her. In order to draw my attention, the court understood the implication immediately. Whoever had kidnapped the woman was not simply targeting a human waitress. They were setting a trap for the vampire king himself. The revelation that Clara Whitmore had once saved the life of the vampire king sent a quiet ripple through the ancient court, but the silence that followed was even heavier than the whisper of shock. Ethan remained kneeling at the base of the throne steps, his body trembling from exhaustion, yet he forced himself to stay awake because he knew every second mattered. King Alaric. Nightfall stood motionless for a moment longer, staring toward the storm beyond the palace windows. Lightning flashed across the mountains, painting the dark forest in pale silver light. Then something unusual happened. Deep within the ancient structure of the palace, a low sound echoed through the stone corridors. It was not thunder, it was older than that. It was the sound of the inner gates of the palace shifting. The nobles turned their heads at once, because those gates had not moved in generations. Commander Vex frowned slightly and glanced toward the entrance corridor. My king, he said quietly, the lower gates are responding to something. Alaric slowly turned back toward the hall. His expression remained calm, but his eyes sharpened as if he had been expecting this reaction. Ethan looked confused. What does that mean? He asked softly. No one answered him immediately, because the ancient vampires were now listening carefully to the sounds echoing through the palace. The deep iron mechanisms beneath the floor were awakening. The palace itself had been built long before modern cities existed. Its foundations were carved into the mountain during an age when vampire kings ruled entire regions of the world. The inner gates were not ordinary doors, they were ancient wards designed to recognize bloodlines and ancient oaths. Only those bound by certain magic could trigger their movement. One of the older nobles stepped forward slowly, his voice cautious. My king, those gates only react when someone carrying a recognized blood oath enters the domain. The statement caused another wave of uneasy murmurs among the court. Ethan shifted slightly on the stone floor. I do not understand, he said. My mom never told me anything about magic. King Alaric studied the boy carefully, then extended one pale hand toward him. Stand up, child. Ethan hesitated for a moment, but obeyed. He pushed himself to his feet, though his legs shook from fatigue. As he stood upright, a faint glow flickered across the marble floor beneath him. It was so subtle that most humans would not have noticed, but every vampire in the chamber saw it immediately. Commander Vex stepped forward, his expression suddenly tense. My king, there is a mark. The captain knelt slightly and looked at the boy's wrist. Ethan followed his gaze and slowly lifted his arm. A thin red symbol rested just below his palm. It was faint and almost invisible until the palace wards began to react. Ethan stared at it in confusion. I have never seen that before, he said quietly. The nobles erupted into quiet arguments. Blood oath marks do not appear randomly, one vampire said. That symbol belongs to an ancient pact, another whispered. King Alaric moved closer and gently took the boy's wrist, examining the faint symbol. His expression did not change, but the weight of recognition settled in his eyes. This mark was created by a binding oath, he said calmly. Many years ago, when your mother helped me escape the hunters, she demanded one promise in return. I swore that if her bloodline ever needed protection, they would always find refuge within my domain. Ethan blinked in surprise. You mean my mom knew about this? The king released the boy's wrist slowly. Yes, he said, your mother understood the risk of helping a creature like me. That is why she demanded a promise strong enough to protect her family even long after she was gone. A cold realization moved through the court. Whoever kidnapped Clara Whitmore was not only targeting the woman, they had taken someone who carried a blood oath tied directly to the throne of the vampire king. And now the ancient wards of the palace had awakened to confirm it. The palace itself recognized Ethan Whitmore as someone protected by the king's ancient promise. The faint red mark on Ethan's wrist continued to glow softly under the cold light of the palace candles, and every vampire in the chamber could feel the ancient wards of the palace responding to it. The stone beneath their feet seemed almost alive with quiet power, as if the mountain itself had awakened to witness the return of an old promise. Ethan stared at the symbol in confusion, turning his hand slowly. "I do not understand," he whispered. "I never had this before." King Alaric Nightfall released the boy's wrist and stepped back slightly. His expression remained calm, yet the atmosphere around him had changed. The ancient ruler now carried the silent weight of a decision that could affect every vampire in the hall. The nobles began speaking at once, their voices low but urgent. "My king, this changes everything," one of the elder nobles said. "If the palace wards have confirmed the blood oath, then the boy is technically under royal protection." Another vampire stepped forward, his tone sharper. "That does not mean we should intervene in human affairs. The law exists for a reason. If word spreads that the vampire throne protects human families, every hunter in the world will come searching for us." Commander Vex crossed his arms, studying the glowing symbol on the boy's wrist. The captain had served the king for more than 2 centuries, and he knew the danger of breaking ancient laws. "My king, the oath may protect the child within our walls, but rescuing the mother would be direct interference with the human world. The council will not accept such a decision." Ethan looked from one vampire to another, his small face filled with fear and confusion. "Please," he said quietly, "my mom is alone out there. They took her because of me, because she told me to come here." The boy clenched his fists, trying to remain brave, but tears began to gather in his eyes. "I did exactly what she told me to do. I found the palace. I told you her name. Does that mean you will help her?" The question hung in the cold air of the chamber. King Alaric slowly returned to the throne and sat down once more. The movement alone silenced the entire court, because every vampire knew their king never acted without purpose. His crimson eyes rested on Ethan for several long seconds before shifting toward the gathered nobles. "For 600 years, he said calmly, the vampire throne has followed one rule: we do not involve ourselves in human conflicts. That rule preserved our secrecy through wars, revolutions, and the rise of modern cities. If we abandon that law, we risk exposing our world to humanity." The nobles nodded in agreement. The logic was undeniable, yet Alaric continued speaking, his voice steady but quieter. "However, the law was written to prevent chaos, not to erase honor. A king who ignores a sworn blood oath invites something far more dangerous than human hunters." A ripple of unease moved through the court. The older vampires understood exactly what he meant. Ancient promises carried weight beyond politics. They were bound by supernatural forces older than the palace itself. If a vampire king broke a blood oath, the consequences could awaken powers that none of them fully understood. Commander Vex stepped forward again. "Carefully, my king. If the kidnappers know about the oath, then they are deliberately provoking you. They want you to break the law or reveal yourself. It is a trap." Alaric nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "that much is obvious. The question is who would dare to set such a trap for the throne." The hall grew quiet again as the vampires considered the possibilities. Hunters, secret societies, rival supernatural clans, many enemies had reasons to test the power of the vampire king. Ethan took a small step forward, his voice trembling but determined. "I do not care who took her," he said. "I just want my mom back." The simple honesty of the child cut through the cold logic of the court. Alaric looked at him again, and something ancient flickered in his gaze. Not pity, not weakness, something closer to respect. This boy had crossed miles of forest and climbed a forbidden mountain alone because he believed a promise still mattered, and that belief now stood in the center of the vampire king's court, waiting for an answer. The silence that followed Ethan's words settled across the vampire court like a heavy shadow. The boy stood in the center of the ancient hall, small and tired, yet somehow unbroken. His clothes were still damp from the rain outside, and the faint red mark on his wrist continued to glow softly under the candlelight, reminding every vampire present that the palace itself had recognized the ancient blood oath. King Alaric Nightfall watched the child carefully from the throne. His expression remained calm, but his mind had already begun to move through memories older than most human nations. The promise he had sworn to Clara Whitmore had been made during a winter night long ago, a night filled with snow, silence, and danger. The memory returned to him now, with startling clarity. At that time the king had not yet ruled the united vampire clans. He had been traveling alone through the northern forests after escaping a brutal conflict between rival vampire houses. During that journey he had been ambushed by a group of hunters armed with silver weapons and trained dogs. The battle had been violent and brief, but even an immortal creature could be overwhelmed when surrounded. Alaric had managed to escape into the forest, but the hunters followed him through the snow for miles. His strength was fading when he finally reached the edge of a narrow mountain road. That was where he met Clara Whitmore. She had been much younger than a woman driving home late at night through a snowstorm. Her car had stopped when she saw a wounded stranger collapse in the middle of the road. She should have kept driving. Any sensible human would have done exactly that. Instead, she stepped out into the freezing wind and knelt beside a man whose eyes glowed faintly red with hunger. Alaric still remembered the moment. She realized he was not human. Fear had filled her eyes, but she had not screamed. She had not run. Instead, she had helped him stand and guided him into the back seat of her car. When the hunters arrived minutes later, Clara Whitmore lied to them. Without hesitation, she told them no one had passed through the road. She pointed them toward a different trail deeper into the forest. After the hunters left, she drove the wounded vampire far into the mountains where no human patrols traveled. By the time dawn approached, Alaric had regained enough strength to heal himself and prepare to leave. Before disappearing into the wilderness, he offered her gold, protection, and power as repayment. Clara Whitmore had refused all of it. I do not want your money, she told him quietly. I only want one promise. If my family ever needs help someday, you will protect them. That was the oath that now glowed on her son's wrist. Inside the throne room, the memory faded as the king returned to the present. The nobles of the court still waited for his decision. Commander Vex stepped forward again, his voice cautious. My king, if that story is true, then the woman understood what you were. When she helped you, she knowingly protected a vampire. The court murmured quietly. Humans rarely possessed such courage or such foolishness. Alaric did not react to the whispers. Clara Whitmore knew exactly what I was, he said calmly, and yet she chose to risk her life anyway. Ethan listened with wide eyes as the truth of his mother's past unfolded for the first time. She never told me any of this, he said softly. She only said the king was not a monster. The hall fell silent again as those simple words echoed through the ancient chamber. King Alaric leaned slightly forward on the throne, studying the boy with a new intensity. Your mother once protected a stranger without knowing if he deserved that kindness, he said. Now that same kindness has brought her son to my gates. The ancient vampire court waited because everyone present understood what this meant. The debt between Clara Whitmore and the vampire king was no longer a memory. It had returned in the form of a frightened child standing alone before the throne, demanding that a 600-year-old promise be honored. The ancient throne room remained wrapped in silence after the story of Clara Whitmore settled into the minds of every vampire present. Ethan stood in the center of the hall with tired eyes and clenched hands while the faint red mark on his wrist continued to glow softly like a living reminder of the oath that bound his family to the throne of the vampire king. King Alaric Nightfall watched the boy for several long seconds, but before he could speak, the nobles of the court finally broke their silence. A tall vampire with silver hair stepped forward from the circle of nobles. His name was Lord Valerian, one of the oldest members of the council, and his voice carried the cold authority of centuries. My king, he said slowly, no one here doubts that a promise was made, but the matter before us is not a simple debt between two individuals. The entire vampire world stands behind the throne. Another noble joined him, his dark cloak brushing across the marble floor. If you send our forces into the human world to rescue one woman, every hunter and investigator in the region will notice that will break the law that has protected us for hundreds of years. Murmurs of agreement spread through the court. The law separating vampires from human affairs had allowed their kind to survive unseen through revolutions, wars, and the rise of modern technology. Breaking that rule would not only risk the palace, it could expose every hidden sanctuary of their species. Commander Vex stepped forward again, his expression calm but serious. My king, there is another problem, the boy said. The kidnappers mentioned your name directly. They knew about the oath. That means they wanted him to come here. This situation may not simply be a kidnapping, it may be a trap designed to lure you into action. The words echoed through the hall, and several vampires nodded grimly. Ethan listened to the conversation with growing anxiety. I do not understand why anyone would want To trap you, he said quietly, my mom is just a waitress. She works long hours at the diner. She does not have enemies. Alaric studied the boy carefully. Sometimes ordinary people carry connections they do not fully understand. He replied softly, the king, then turned his gaze toward the council of nobles. Speak your concerns clearly, he said. If you believe this is a trap, then explain who would dare to set such a thing for the throne. Lord Valerian folded his hands behind his back. There are several possibilities, my king. Human hunters have grown more organized. During the last few decades, some of them believe the vampire king is not a myth. If they could capture you or reveal your existence, they would become legends among their kind. Another noble spoke next. Or it could be the work of rival supernatural groups, the witch covens of the Western Mountains have always resented vampire influence. If they discovered a blood oath between you and a human, they might attempt to manipulate it for their own purposes. The court fell into tense discussion as different theories emerged. Some vampires blamed hunters, others suspected ancient rival clans that still resented Alaric's rule over the vampire houses. Ethan stood quietly in the middle of the chamber, listening to voices debate the fate of his mother as if she were a distant political problem. Finally, the boy could not remain silent anymore. He stepped forward slightly and looked directly at the throne. I do not care who took her, he said with quiet determination. Hunters, witches, vampires, it does not matter. They took my mom, and she told me to find you because she believed you would help her. The nobles grew quiet again as the simple honesty of the child cut through their arguments. Ethan took a shaky breath, but continued speaking. My mom always told me that promises matter, she said. The world becomes a darker place when powerful people forget the promises they made. King Alaric leaned back slightly on the throne, watching the boy with thoughtful eyes around him. The ancient court waited, because everyone understood that the next words spoken by the vampire king would decide whether an old promise would remain a memory or become a war. The throne room remained silent after the boy's words echoed through the ancient chamber. Ethan Whitmore stood alone in the center of the hall, surrounded by creatures who had lived through centuries of human history, yet none of them spoke for several long moments because the truth in the child's voice carried a strange weight. King Alaric Nightfall rested one hand on the arm of the dark stone throne and slowly rose to his feet. The simple movement instantly silenced the whispers among the nobles, because every vampire present understood that their king's patience had reached its limit. The tall figure of the ancient ruler stepped down from the throne platform and began walking toward the center of the hall. Each step echoed across the marble floor like the slow beat of a distant drum. Lord Valerian straightened his posture as the king approached. My king, he said carefully, we only ask that you consider the consequences. If this is a trap, then walking into it could expose our entire world. Alaric stopped in front of the gathered nobles and looked at them one by one. His crimson eyes reflected the pale candlelight, but his voice remained calm. For 6 centuries, you have followed my rule, he said slowly. During that time, our kind survived wars, plagues, revolutions, and the rise of human technology, because we honored the laws that protect our secrecy. Several of the nobles nodded respectfully. The king's leadership had indeed preserved the vampire world through dangerous centuries. Yet Alaric continued speaking, his tone slightly colder. But there is another law older than the throne itself. It is the law of oath and honor. The court grew quiet again, because every ancient vampire understood the importance of those words. A broken oath could destroy trust among immortal beings whose memories lasted forever. Commander Vex watched carefully as the king turned toward Ethan again. The boy still stood with tired determination despite the exhaustion in his eyes. King Alaric spoke directly to him. Ethan Whitmore, your mother once stood between me and death. When she had every reason to run away, she asked for only one promise in return. That promise was not made lightly. The king's voice carried across the chamber, so every vampire could hear it clearly. I swore that if her bloodline ever needed protection, my door would never be closed to them. Ethan nodded slowly, remembering his mother's quiet words during the long nights at their small apartment. She always said promises mattered even when the world forgot them. Lord Valerian stepped forward again, but his tone remained cautious. My king, none of us question your honor, but if the kidnappers intended to provoke you, then rescuing this woman could begin a chain of events that threatens the stability of our entire society. Alaric studied the council member for a moment, then turned back toward the throne steps. When he spoke again, his voice carried the quiet authority that had ruled the vampire clans for generations. Stability built on broken promises is nothing more than fear, he said calmly. The court fell completely silent as the ancient king reached the base of the throne platform again. He paused for a moment, then faced the nobles of the council. I will not ignore a sworn blood oath simply because honoring it may be dangerous if our enemies believe they can manipulate the throne. By threatening those under my protection, then they misunderstand what it means to challenge the king of vampires. The air in the chamber seemed to grow colder as the full meaning of his words settled into the room. Ethan looked up at him with a mixture of hope and disbelief. Alaric turned toward Commander Vex, and his voice became firm and clear. Send scouts to the forests surrounding Hollow Creek. Begin searching for any sign of the men who took Clara Whitmore. We will learn who dared to set this trap. The captain bowed his head immediately as the command echoed through the hall around them. The ancient nobles exchanged uneasy glances because they all understood what had just happened. The vampire king had chosen a side, and for the first time in centuries that side belonged to a human family bound to him by an old promise. The command of the vampire king spread through the palace like a silent storm. Commander Vex bowed once before turning sharply toward the great doors of the throne hall, and several armored guards immediately followed him. Their footsteps echoed across the marble as they moved quickly to carry out the king's order. Ethan Whitmore watched them leave with wide eyes. His heart beat faster than it had since he first climbed the mountain, because for the first time since his mother was taken, he felt a small spark of hope. King Alaric Nightfall remained standing beside the throne platform, his expression calm, yet thoughtful. The ancient ruler understood that sending scouts into the forest was only the beginning. Whoever had kidnapped Clara Whitmore had done so with purpose and preparation. They had known about the blood oath. They had known the boy would come to the palace. That meant the enemy understood far more about the vampire world than any ordinary human. Should Lord Valerian stepped forward again, his silver hair reflecting the pale candlelight. My king, the scouts will search the region, but if the kidnappers expected this, they may already be far away. Hollow Creek is surrounded by highways and abandoned mining roads. They could disappear quickly. Alaric nodded slowly, which is exactly why we will not rely only on scouts, he replied. His crimson eyes moved across the gathered nobles, searching the faces of the ancient council. Several of you maintain informants within human cities, he continued. Quiet networks of watchers who track unusual activity. I want every contact activated tonight. The nobles exchanged glances, but none of them objected. They understood that once the king issued such an order, the matter had already moved beyond simple debate. Ethan stood quietly near the center of the hall, unsure whether he should speak again. The boy felt very small among creatures who had lived longer than most countries, yet the king suddenly turned toward him and asked a gentle question. Ethan Whitmore, when the men took your mother, did you notice anything unusual about them? The boy thought carefully before answering. They were not dressed like normal criminals, he said slowly. Their coats were dark and heavy, almost like uniforms, and one of them had a strange symbol on his sleeve. Ethan raised his hand and traced the shape in the air. It looked like a circle with sharp lines crossing through it. The description caused several nobles to stiffen slightly. Commander Vex, who had paused near the doorway, turned back toward the throne. My king, that symbol matches the insignia used by the Order of the Crimson Eye. The hall filled with uneasy murmurs. Ethan looked confused. Who are they? He asked. The captain stepped forward again, his voice serious. They are one of the oldest hunter organizations in North America. Unlike ordinary hunters, they study supernatural creatures. With great patience, they gather information for years before striking their targets. Alaric listened carefully, his expression unreadable. The Order of the Crimson Eye had been a distant nuisance for centuries, but they rarely attempted direct attacks against vampire strongholds. If they had taken Clara Whitmore, it meant they believed the bait was strong enough to draw him out. Lord Valerian folded his arms behind his back. My king, if the Crimson Eye is involved, then the situation is more dangerous than we imagined. They will not simply be hiding in the forest waiting for us to arrive. Their headquarters is likely protected by layers of human law enforcement and surveillance systems. Alaric turned slowly toward the tall windows again, where lightning flashed across the distant mountains. The storm outside had not yet ended, and the thunder rolled across the cliffs like distant drums of war. Then the king spoke quietly, but firmly. If the Order of the Crimson Eye believes a frightened human mother is enough to control the throne of vampires, then they have misunderstood the nature of the promise I made centuries ago. The court waited in tense silence as he finished speaking, because they could all sense that the situation was no longer a simple rescue mission. The kidnapping of Clara Whitmore had just revealed a hidden enemy bold enough to challenge the ancient king himself. The storm outside the mountain palace continued to rumble across the dark sky as the throne room settled into a tense and thoughtful silence. The revelation about the Order of the Crimson Eye had changed the atmosphere of the entire court. Ethan Whitmore stood quietly near the center of the chamber, watching the ancient vampires debate his mother's fate as if they were discussing a distant war instead of the life of a single woman. Yet the boy remained steady because he had already traveled too far to lose hope. Now King Alaric Nightfall slowly descended the final step from the throne platform and walked across the marble floor until he stood a few feet away from Ethan. The ancient ruler studied the child carefully. The faint red oath mark still glowed on the boy's wrist, proof that the promise made many years ago was still alive. Alaric then turned his gaze toward the council of nobles. His voice, when he spoke, carried the calm authority of centuries. The Order of the Crimson Eye has hunted supernatural creatures for generations, he said quietly. Their leaders believe knowledge is power. They study patiently. They gather secrets until they are confident they can control the situation. Lord Valerian nodded slowly. That is exactly why this situation troubles the council, my king. If the hunters knew about the oath, then they must have been studying Clara Whitmore and her family for years. The hall filled with quiet agreement. Many of the elder vampires had fought hunter organizations before, and they understood how dangerous such enemies could become when given enough time. Commander Vex stepped forward again, his expression serious. My king, if the Crimson Eye captured Clara Whitmore, then they likely intend to use her as leverage. They may believe that forcing you to rescue her will reveal your location or expose our kind to human authorities. Alaric listened without interruption, because every possibility had already crossed his mind. The hunters were intelligent and patient. They had chosen their bait carefully. Ethan looked up at the king with nervous determination. Are they going to hurt my mom? He asked softly. The question carried a quiet weight that silenced the entire chamber for a moment. Even the oldest vampires seemed uncomfortable. King Alaric looked down at the boy and answered with calm honesty. Hunters prefer information before violence, he said slowly. Your mother is more valuable alive than dead. The Crimson Eye believes she is the key to controlling my actions. Ethan swallowed hard, but nodded because he understood the truth in the king's words. If they want to control you, then they will wait for you to come find them, he said. Alaric allowed the faintest hint of approval to pass across his expression. The boy was perceptive despite his fear. Yes, he replied, they will expect me to walk directly into their trap, because they believe the oath leaves me no other choice. Lord Valerian folded his arms behind his back. Then perhaps the council should consider a different approach, he said carefully. If the hunters believe the king will rush blindly into their trap, they may not expect patience or strategy. The hall fell silent again as the idea began to take shape. King Alaric slowly turned toward the great windows where lightning flashed across the distant forest. His mind moved through centuries of battle and political conflict. He had defeated rival vampire houses, ancient warlords, and supernatural conspiracies by understanding one simple truth: the enemy, who believes they understand your weakness, often exposes their own. Ethan watched the king quietly because he sensed that something important was about to change. Alaric finally turned back toward the court and spoke with quiet certainty. The Order of the Crimson Eye believes they have discovered my weakness, he said. They believe a frightened human mother can force the throne of vampires to obey their demands. The ancient ruler paused for a moment, and the room seemed to grow colder. Then they will soon learn a lesson that every enemy of this throne eventually discovers. When you challenge the king of vampires, you do not control the game, you simply reveal where the battlefield will be. The thunder outside the mountain palace rolled across the cliffs like distant war drums, as the ancient court remained frozen in thoughtful silence. After the words of King Alaric Nightfall, Ethan Whitmore stood in the center of the vast chamber with his small hands clenched tightly at his sides. The boy had listened to creatures older than nations debate strategies and hidden enemies, yet none of that mattered to him as much as the single question that continued to echo in his heart: whether his mother was still safe somewhere beyond the mountains. Clara Whitmore was alone in the hands of the Order of the Crimson Eye, and every passing minute felt heavier than the last. King Alaric turned away from the tall windows and looked Directly at Ethan, the ancient ruler's expression softened slightly, though his presence still carried the cold power of centuries. The child had crossed forest highways and a forbidden mountain, because he believed a promise still meant something. That kind of courage was rare, even among immortal beings. Ethan, he said quietly, tell me something about your mother that the hunters would never understand. The boy blinked in surprise, but answered after a moment. She is brave, he said. She does not think she is brave, but she works late every night at the diner and still comes home smiling, because she says I should not worry about money. His voice trembled slightly, but he continued, she always says that kindness is stronger than fear. The hall grew quiet again as the simple words echoed through the chamber. King Alaric listened carefully, because the description matched the memory he carried from that winter night long ago. Clara Whitmore had never seen herself as heroic, yet she had faced armed hunters to protect a stranger. She did not understand that kind of courage often changed the course of events in ways even ancient kings could not predict. Ethan lowered his head for a moment. Then he looked up again, with sudden determination. My mom always said something else too, he continued. She said that monsters are not the ones with sharp teeth. Monsters are the ones who forget their promises. The words struck the chamber with unexpected force. Several nobles shifted uncomfortably, while others simply stared at the child. King Alaric remained still for a moment longer before stepping closer, until he stood only a few feet away from Ethan. The difference in height between them made the boy seem even smaller, yet the king did not tower over him with intimidation. Instead, he spoke with a calm seriousness that carried the weight of centuries. Your mother once showed mercy to a creature the human world calls a monster, he said softly. She believed that even someone like me could keep a promise. Ethan nodded quickly, because that was exactly what Clara had always told him. Alaric placed one hand gently on the boy's shoulder in a gesture that stunned the watching court. No vampire king had ever shown such open acknowledgement toward a human child inside the throne hall. Your mother was correct, he continued quietly. I do not forget my promises. Ethan felt his chest tighten with emotion, but he tried to remain brave, because crying would not help his mother. The boy took a slow breath and spoke again. My mom believed you would help us, even if everyone else said it was impossible. The king studied the child for a long moment, before finally straightening and turning toward the council of nobles. His voice carried across the hall, once more filled with the calm certainty of an ancient ruler. The Crimson Eye believes they can force my hand by threatening someone under my protection. They believe fear will guide my actions. The court listened carefully as he finished speaking, but they have misunderstood the nature of the promise. Clara Whitmore asked of me. This was never a promise made from weakness. It was a promise made from honor, and honor is something even hunters cannot predict. The storm outside roared louder as the words settled across the chamber, and every vampire present understood that the final decision of the king was about to reshape the fate of everyone involved. The storm over the mountain palace slowly began to fade as the final echoes of thunder rolled across the dark sky. Inside the great hall, the ancient court waited in complete silence, because every vampire present understood that the moment of decision had arrived. King Alaric Nightfall stood beside the throne platform, with Ethan Whitmore at his side. The faint red mark of the blood oath still glowed on the boy's wrist, like a living reminder of a promise made many years ago. The king looked across the gathered nobles, and his voice carried through the chamber with calm authority. The Order of the Crimson Eye believes they understand my weakness, he said. They believe the life of one human mother can be used to command the throne of vampires. But they are wrong, because they misunderstand the nature of the promise. Clara Whitmore asked of me. He turned slightly toward Commander Vex. Send word to the scouts immediately. The hunters will not remain hidden for long. They will want proof that their trap has succeeded. They will contact us soon. The captain nodded once and left the chamber quickly to relay the order. The court waited only a few minutes before the great doors of the throne hall opened. Again a messenger guard entered and bowed deeply before the king. My lord, the scouts have intercepted a transmission from a human radio tower near the old mining valley. The message was meant for you. The chamber grew still as the guard handed a small recording device to the king. Alaric activated the device, and a calm human voice filled the hall. Vampire King, if you are hearing this message, then our experiment has succeeded. We have Clara Whitmore alive and unharmed for centuries. Your kind has hidden in darkness while feeding on humanity. Tonight that ends. Come alone to the abandoned mining facility in the northern valley. If you wish to see the woman again, you will follow our instructions precisely. The recording ended and silence returned to the chamber. Ethan looked up at the king with fear and hope mixed together. That is where they took her, he whispered. Alaric closed his hand around the device. Slowly the hunters believed they had written the final move in their trap, but they had forgotten one important truth about immortal rulers. He turned toward the council of nobles and spoke clearly. Prepare a transport team. We leave immediately. Several nobles began to protest, but the king raised his hand. The hunters demanded that I come alone. He said calmly, that condition will be respected. The transport will remain hidden beyond the valley until I give the signal. Ethan stepped forward suddenly. I want to come with you, he said. My mom needs to see that I did not give up on her. The court reacted with surprise, but Alaric studied the boy carefully. Your courage is admirable, he said softly, but this path is dangerous. Ethan lifted his chin. My mom always says courage means doing the right thing, even when you are scared. The king considered the words for a moment, then placed one hand on the boy's shoulder. Very well, he said, you will remain beside me. When we bring your mother home, she will see that you kept your promise. The journey to the valley took less than 1 hour under the cover of the fading storm. When Alaric entered the abandoned mining facility, the hunters waited exactly where they promised. Clara Whitmore was tied to a chair, but she was unharmed. Her eyes widened with shock when she saw the ancient vampire standing beside her son, the leader of the Crimson. I stepped forward believing victory was already his, but the hunters had misunderstood one final detail about the king. They tried to manipulate the moment they revealed themselves. The hidden transport team surrounded the facility with silent precision. The hunters quickly realized their trap had closed around them instead of their prey. Within minutes, the Order of the Crimson I surrendered. Clara Whitmore was freed, and Ethan ran into her arms with tears of relief. For a long moment, mother and son simply held each other while the storm clouds finally cleared above the valley. Clara looked up at King Alaric with quiet gratitude. I knew you would remember your promise, she said. The ancient ruler gave a small nod before turning back toward the dark mountains. The oath between them had been fulfilled, and the balance between the human world and the vampire throne remained intact. But deep within the ancient palace, the story of the night, a small human boy reminded a 600-year-old king about the power of a promise would be remembered for many centuries to come.